this conversation on decolonizing anti-racism. And what we're going to do in this conversation is really draw upon Sangeetha's work and some of my own thinking in terms of conceptualizing what it means to look at anti-racist interventions, what does it mean to look at decolonization, and then actually critique both decolonization and anti-racist struggles, particularly in terms of moving the locus of these conversations into spaces in the global south.
Yeah. So I'm most well known for my work on what I call Chinese privilege in Singapore, which is really looking at how racism functions in Singapore, which seems like a real shock to most people considering what little they actually know of Singapore, as well as the fact that when we think of racism, we think of it almost entirely as white supremacy, as linked to colonialism, as about white racism, and the idea that what the West calls people of color, like brown and black people and Chinese people, East Asian people, could be racist in the context where they have power is actually a really new thing. It seems to be really shattering for a lot of people in the global north, while for me as a minority who has lived in Singapore for most of my life, this kind of the fact that like most of the racism that's been directed at me my whole life is by Chinese people in Singapore and not by white people. I've lived in England, I've been in America, I now live in Australia. And so like a lot of my work is about localizing the discourse on racism. It's about moving the gaze away from the global north, from the discourse of America, and allowing for us to be able to talk about racism in these really specific ways. And by moving that gaze away, what we are trying to do is decolonize the current discourse on racism, which is why we're calling it decolonizing anti-racism.
Excellent. So maybe as we introduce this conversation, let's look at some of the questions that we are going to set up in terms of thinking through what does it mean to participate in this process of decolonization. And one of the things that we want to do in this process is to suggest that by erasing articulations of racism in various parts of the world, what we tend to do is, on one hand, erase possibilities of emancipatory change. That's one part. But the other is by erasing these struggles across different spaces, we also actually participate in a form of violence where we ignore the kinds of effects that racism produces on bodies in tangible ways across spaces globally.
Yeah. So one of the things that this white paper is trying to do is really question the primacy of the way we talk about anti-racism now, because it's so situated in the global north, especially America. There's discourses around how almost all resistance theory and thought comes out of America, which is really erasing to the people on the margins, Dalit activism in India, my activism in Singapore, people who've been working on these things for a long time. We want to really look at the entry point of the local so that we don't end up erasing people unwittingly or unknowingly. The current discourse of anti-racism, right, it actually cannot account for people who are considered victims of racism in the global north, but who are themselves perpetrators and oppressors back home. And there's actually very little space and possibility and language for us to be able to talk about it and hold space for people who are, like I said, victims and oppressors, depending on the kind of localized geography and histories and context that we come from. So this paper is really looking at that kind of decolonization where we are really trying to go down to the local. The current discourse, like I said, it cannot account for people who are perpetrators back home, and it's not even very difficult for us to think about this, right? Think about the genocide in Sri Lanka. Sinhalese people are considered brown and therefore would be considered oppressed in many parts of the global north, but in Sri Lanka itself, they are the holders of immense privilege and power and have perpetrated a genocide on minority Tamil people for decades. So how do we account for that in a social justice space in America or in Australia? If Sinhalese people and Tamil people are in the same space, there's no way, and it is not right that we treat them the same, but we do. We end up kind of perpetuating these kinds of oppressions by homogenizing all of these people. So the same goes for Burma and the same goes for Singapore, and we're just trying to get people to be much more aware of these little nuances and dynamics between people of color, as we would call them, so that we don't end up perpetuating these same dynamics unwittingly.
So part of the decolonization process for us then is paying close attention to where we stand and where we situate ourselves. I talk about this in terms of border crossings. So the upper class Indian in India that is very much part of perpetuating caste violence travels across the Atlantic and goes to New York and plays the brown oppressed victim, completely erasing the kind of caste politics you actually see in India. And this is something you see in much of post-colonial scholarship, in much of subaltern studies scholarship, where sort of the elite brown scholar becomes the voice without interrogating the actual sites of constitution that are fairly racist.
I mean, maybe the most well-known subaltern scholar is Spivak, right? And Spivak herself is a rich Brahmin. But Spivak is seen as the brown woman to go to who talks about these kinds of oppressions, while her privilege and her ability to even be this well-known voice of brown oppression comes from the fact that she is Brahmin and she is upper caste and she has money back home. And we can see that these things are happening in North America with upper caste South Asians who are casting themselves as victims, and these kinds of victimhood playing is never questioned, and it ends up perpetuating these dynamics again in other parts of the world, which is what we're trying to avoid.
And Sangeetha, I think one thing which is also very powerful is that just this conversation with you continuously makes me aware of my own position of privilege and where I stand from. That I'm able to articulate and have access to certain spaces because of my own privilege and the ways in which that enables me to move through or enables my mobility into sites and discourses of articulation.
That might not always be open to so many other people without these kinds of really specific access. So some of the questions that are guiding the framework around what we are proposing as decolonizing anti-racism is how do current anti-racist theories and discourses erase those on the margins around the globe? And we're trying to look, remember the opening question, one thing I was saying is that anti-racist discourse at the moment cannot account, or it does not give us a language to be able to hold space for people who could be victims of racism in America as well as perpetrators of racism back home. And so what we're trying to do is come up with a framework that actually allows us to do that. So what does a decolonized anti-racist framework that actually does that look like? What could it possibly look like? How would we be able to apply it? And that's the last question, right? How can we apply this framework to understanding race relations outside of the global north? Because there's so many dynamics, there's so much nuances, there's so many little historical issues and problems between so many people in so many parts of the world, and yet all over the world, what we really talk about is only racism that is centered on white versus the other, and the other is all of us, even though even within the others, there are so many issues and problems that just get swept under the carpet.
So I want to build on this, Sangeetha, to talk a little bit about this question of why decolonization perhaps and situate that particular context. So maybe we open up by talking about the overarching question of decolonization, which often has been positioned within contemporary context as decentering Eurocentrism and decentering whiteness. And absolutely that is critical because the colonial enterprise of knowledge production itself has historically erased sites of articulation. Having said that, what is also of caution is the ways in which then that decolonial turn itself becomes a colonial position that by virtue of its occupying the space of decoloniality erases the particular sites where violences are carried out across the global south. So, as an example, we talked about Singapore. To extend on that, let's think about China and the Chinese violence and oppression in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. Now, if you think about China as a sort of space for decolonization, without attending to the plight of the Muslim minorities in China. What you have essentially done is you have become complicit in a framework that perpetuates racist violence under the logic of decolonization.
Yeah. Under the logic of almost anti-imperialism.
Yes.
It's almost like a lot of these things are swept under the rug as being, if you're anti-Western, therefore you must be anti-imperialist, which doesn't even actually make sense. But unfortunately, the kind of discourse that we have right now is so black and white in these terms. And we see decolonial writers and post-colonial thinkers actually almost implicitly saying that all criticism of China and Chinese imperial activities in Tibet and Xinjiang are actually just a product of Western propaganda. And that's a threat that's been going around. Why? Because China is seen as the anti-US country to support, and people are almost seen as, oh, if I dislike American imperialism, I must support China, which doesn't make sense because China is the imperial country in Asia. So when we talk about this idea of the Asian turn and the Singapore model, right? The Singapore model is seen as both in terms of its economy, as something for other countries to follow, and as well as in how it handles its multiracial population. It's kind of policies that are meant to bring people together on the surface anyway, in housing and in other things, are often written about by writers like Farid Zakaria, who say that the US should look to Singapore as a model for how to deal with its own multiracial population. But when you scratch on the surface of the Singapore model, you find that this is only possible through intensely repressive measures, measures that are meant to restrict freedoms of speech and expression, where people who talk about racism are themselves called racist and are threatened and detained at the airport and by the state. So what happens is that you may look at Singapore from the outside and think that, oh, this is a great model, but the model is sustained and maintained by an intense oppression of its people, especially its minorities, which inevitably contributes to the kind of racial inequalities that you actually are existing in Singapore and are very similar to the kind of racial inequalities in America. And yet, so many writers talk about how Singapore is a model for us to follow. And all of this is bound up in these ideas around the Asian turn, which inevitably erase those who are the ones who are being oppressed in these areas. So one of the things that Mohan talks about is this idea of a communicative nature of decolonization, right? And how we want to, this kind of anti-racism is in itself violent. Mohan, you should talk more about that.
Okay, great. So I want to build on your idea of Singapore model to get this point across. So if you think about the Singapore model as an exemplar of decolonization in the global south, when I talk about this as a communicative turn, what I mean is that the production of Singapore as a Singapore model, as decolonization, itself works to perpetuate a kind of governmentality, a form of governmentality that is neoliberal, that is hyper-capitalist, that is authoritarian. So what does this mean, for instance, when the Singapore model moves into Bangalore or moves into New Delhi or moves into Gujarat? That the mobility of the model is precisely because of its appeal for authoritarian control, state surveillance, and production of particular kind of capitalism. So in the communicative turn then, what I'm arguing is that by looking at the location and carefully interrogating it, we need to make explicit what is actually decolonial about that production. So in that sense, the Singapore model is not decolonial at all. In fact, it is very much an instrument of Western Eurocentric capitalism in some of its worst excesses. But it is produced then as a decolonial
model. Along with us decolonizing anti-racism, what we also want to do is decolonize the concept of multiculturalism, which is almost seen as an unassailable public good in many parts of the world, as a goal in itself, as if we can just have lots of different people, lots of different food and cultures, we've done it. Racism has gone away and it will never come back. Multiculturalism is sold on these terms, and we want to really decolonize the neoliberal aspects of multiculturalism. Mohan?
Yeah. So, part of the production again of multiculturalism as a concept becomes a PR tool where if you take within the context of Singapore, the CMIO model, the Chinese, Malay, Indian, other
others.
model of management is given as a model for managing multiculturalism, and which I have sort of been seduced by at different points of time for sure, in terms of this being a practical model of bringing people together.
Yeah.
But the point worth noting, and which is the critical point when you ask about voice,
Yeah.
and the voices of raised classed margins, is to think about the ways in which these multicultural models actually erase spaces of authentic participation driven by states' overall production of multiculturalism as a particular model of management. So in some ways, multiculturalism itself becomes a tool for erasing cultured voices from particular spaces of the global south.
Yeah, so we see this a lot in Singapore because Singapore likes to commodify everything. So minority cultures are themselves commodified. There's Little India, and there is the Malay area. And these spaces are actually sold to tourists as a place where you come and you experience authentic minority culture in Singapore. You come to Singapore for all the different types of food and all these cultural experiences. But the actual people who are part of these cultures are oftentimes erased and marginalized while the state commodifies and sells these cultures for tourist consumption. And in this way, the discourse of multiculturalism actually perpetuates this, to the point where in Singapore, multiculturalism is seen as such an important thing that anything that threatens even just the idea of multiculturalism, which includes talking about Chinese racism in Singapore, is seen as something that cannot exist because it's such a threat to just the idea of multiculturalism. So as Mohan is saying, in this case, multiculturalism, which is sold as a good thing, is in itself actually really violent and used to shut down and erase voices who, by talking about racism, are seen as being a threat to multiculturalism.
Sangeetha, this is so beautiful because, I think about the production of the idea of harmony.
Yeah.
So multiculturalism to produce or to generate harmony. So that, your critique, for instance, would be seen as seditious, which itself, by the way, is a British or a colonial concept, right?
Yeah.
So it would be seen as seditious because it is disruptive of harmony.
Yeah.
But even that idea of harmony that this is predicated upon is a Chinese idea, an idea of faith.
Yeah.
That sort of is.
Yeah, Singapore's idea of harmony, of racial harmony, is very Chinese. It's very much about the facade or the idea of saving face to the rest of the world. As long as we seem harmonious, it doesn't matter who is erased or who is hurt in the process. And this idea of harmony is really false because it's not even about real authentic interaction, exchanges. It's really it's really quite akin to the British divide and rule, actually. And you said this, like a lot of multiculturalism is rooted in imperialism, actually. So in Singapore, like the minorities are supposed to be integrated, but at the same time they have the different races have the Chinese have their own schools in Singapore. In fact, the special assistant plan schools, and we have different minority self-help groups as well. So while we can see that this idea of multiculturalism is really, it's not something that is facilitating real, honest, authentic interactions between majorities and minorities, between people. It's really about keeping the facade of the Singapore model going on the international stage.
And certainly it is a multiculturalism that works to erase Indian argumentativeness.
Yeah.
Because as an Indian, we are by nature argumentative and therefore disruptive of that
supposedly,
multiculturalism.
yes. Yeah. So India is possibly the world's most truest democracy. It's a federation. It has intense arguments and people disagreeing with each other, and yet India's not in any it's not going to collapse at any point in time. But that kind of democracy, that kind of multiculturalism or multiracialism, multi-religiosity is not the kind of multiculturalism that Singapore wants, the kind where there is debate and there is honest communication. Singapore wants the kind of multiculturalism that can be sold because in the end, that's what Singapore is about. It's about commodifying and selling anything.
But that commoditization also supports global capital.
Yeah.
It supports techniques of capital to manage spaces and people.
Yeah.
We will all be civil and participate in specific forms of participation mandated by the state and capitalist structures.
Which is why Singapore gets away with the kind of serious human rights abuses that it does, that other countries will not get away with, where America will say something, or the United Nations might say something. In Singapore, you are not allowed to have a lawyer in the room when you are interrogated by the police. This would be considered a serious human rights abuse in any other part of the world. But because Singapore, by its nature, is such a big part of this global capital, that the kinds of things that other countries cannot do, Singapore does, and in fact is completely swept under the rug and is not even talked about. So Singapore is really smart in that sense, by selling itself in this way, but commodifying itself, by making sure that it's this part of global capital. It also gets to do the things without censure that other countries do not. Yeah. So we've talked a lot about decolonizing anti-racism, Singapore, Chinese privilege, and all of these things, right? But lastly, we want to end with, so what does that framework even look like? What are the pathways and prescriptions to decolonizing anti-racism?
And the first thing that we talked about, and this came up again and again, is the idea of solidarity. And here we really want to think through this concept somewhat more, because we feel that one of the things that often happens under the umbrella of decolonization is the kind of individualized politics, where as an individual, by adopting the language of decolonization, I can have all kinds of benefits come to me. But when it comes to the real embodied struggles of people in the global south, I am quick to put people under the bus. So there is this constant tension between what a politics of decolonization actually ought to look like, vis-a-vis the use of decolonization as a tool by us, the elite from particular spaces in the global south, to aggrandize our own agendas, our own careers, to support a particular kind of opportunism and careerism that is highly individualistic, highly neoliberal, completely devoid of the real, authentic struggles of people on the ground with racism.
Yeah. I mean, solidarity is really important. And the thing is that it's really interesting, like Mohan was saying, that we talk about solidarity, but the South is continually erased. And I can see this in my criticism of Crazy Rich Asians, the movie. When I criticized the movie as showing a facade of Singapore that perpetuated the kind of racism that already exists, Asian Americans were very shocked. They saw me as trying to ruin their first great movie, which is already very problematic. But the point being that there was no solidarity with minorities in Singapore, even though Asian Americans are themselves minorities in America. And this kind of lack of solidarity between minorities in the global north with the rest of us in the global south is very obvious, and it's really hypocritical, actually. And which brings us to the idea of the context of the local. Partly it's because people in the global north are unwilling and unable to really understand these different contexts of the local. And it's also because of this kind of Western privilege and arrogance that even people of color in the West often have. They see themselves as producers of knowledge, and they see us as passive imbibers of it, and they completely erase the kind of already existing resistances and activism on the ground. And sometimes they even go so far as to co-opt it, erase it. The kind of almost, we are from the West, even though we are oppressed, we are still better than what's happening back home and the people back home. And so, like, one of the things we want to look at is solidarity, but solidarity in the context of the local. There are many things that we do not know. Like, a lot of times in my conversations with people about Singapore is oh my God, I did not know Singapore was like this. And I get that. I really do. Because if that's not your life, if that's not your daily experience, if that's not something that you've been exposed to, I actually really understand how easy it is for people to come to Singapore, look at the nice buildings, go to the zoo and Marina Bay, and just go home. It's actually really easy to do that. And that's what we're asking people to stop doing. When you are in places like Singapore, scratch the surface, look at the local, talk to local people about what's really happening. So solidarity by activists and people of color in the global north with the rest of us in the global south by allowing us to actually implicate and complicate racist discourses by contextualizing in the local is what we're looking for, and it's what's really important. And I think Black Lives Matter is actually a really great example of this because of the way that they hooked up with BDS and Palestinian people, and they taught each other how to, like, Palestinians taught Black Lives Matter, especially people who were on the ground in Ferguson, how to deal with tear gas and the police using tear gas on them. And that kind of incredible, like, transnational, transcultural solidarity, that's what we're looking for.
Yeah, and in this sense, solidarity is really powerful when connected across local spaces.
Yeah.
But then this is also powerful in terms of disrupting a particular kind of decolonization that works by marginalizing. So I will just give a couple of examples to walk through this point. How often have you heard an Indian arrive in Silicon Valley or in the Big Apple coming from, say, the IT sector or the finance sector, and then look at African Americans in the US and say, oh, these are Kallus. Or come to New Zealand and say that, oh, there are the lazy Maoris.
Maoris, yeah.
Right? So often in the politics of color, we participate in particular logics of capital that work precisely by putting other communities of color under the bus. And I think that is the seduction of capital, which is by divide and rule, by individualizing people, reducing them to profitable circuits of capital so that you can be the banker working at Citibank and count for its diversity because of your skin color.
And be the token brown in a very white space by, in Australia, like it's almost a necessity for immigrants to engage in the kind of anti-Indigenous discourse so as to be able to position themselves as not them. So as to be able to gain access to white patronage and access to these kinds of spaces which are predicated on keeping Indigenous people out of their own spaces. What is their space to begin with?
Right. And therefore, what is really exciting is the possibility of progressive movements of people of color in the global south and south in the north, and finding those spaces of progressive movements.
Yeah, and finding those spaces and finding those moments of connections, of similarities, of like, you've experienced that, so have I. How shocking is it that we've both experienced the same thing, thousands and thousands of miles apart, completely different historical contexts, and finding that solidarity is what is really going to maybe help us get out of this. The other thing that we were looking at in terms of prescriptions was interrogating our own locations. Mohan's going to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, and part of interrogating our own locations is to, Spivak talks about privilege is loss, and the idea how privilege itself becomes a site that produces various kinds of erasures so that articulations cannot be made, or if they are made, cannot be registered in a way that it is meaningful. So, building on this idea that interrogation attends to the ways in which our participation in particular circuits of knowledge production, particular struggles continue to erase spaces for other people, spaces for the other, to articulate its own voices and its own positions. And in that sense, I think, Sangeetha, it is also a journey in humility in terms of really opening to learn. Like you talk about, coming to Singapore and really looking at what is happening with experiences of Tamil people, right? So when I come into Singapore as an expat, my experience is very different because it is packaged as a city in a very different way for me. So to break out of that is to actually find spaces of listening and humility.
Yeah, it's definitely about, I mean, any space that you walk into that makes a very clear and very easy distinction between oppressor and oppressed is one that you should be suspicious of. Because it's never that simple and it's never going to be that easy. What you want to do is really interrogate both the space and yourself, like your friends, and who are these people, how do they move in a space, our existence and our physical presence in a space, and even our voices, and who speaks and who doesn't, and who speaks over whom and who speaks for whom. All of these are really important, and we need to move away from really simplistic understandings of white people can't say this, only these people can say this. But even amongst these people, who is saying what? Who are they erasing by saying this? What are they speaking to? What experience are they pretending to that might not necessarily be theirs? And it's very easy for us to gloss over them because white supremacy is a problem worldwide. Of course it is. Colonialism is everywhere. There are only 6 countries in the world that England never tried to invade. So that's something that we are all fighting against. But fighting against it by erasing the nuances between us isn't going to work. In the end, what you want is authentic solidarity, authentic discourse, authentic conversation. And anything that erases or requires people to erase these issues between each other in order for that to happen cannot be authentic.
You know, I also really like your point about interrogation in the sense of questioning turns toward homogenizing.
Yeah.
Like if you talk about the Asian turn, think about it critically. Why are we even talking about the Asian turn today?
Yeah.
Is it because China is now a global power economically and financially so that it can now invest into Confucian institutes that it sends out in different parts of the world to do PR for China? And if you take that as the Asian turn,
Yep.
then what your Asian turn is it's the Confucian turn, right? It is the turn to Confucius, so that you have conference after conference on the Asian turn that is pretty much about Han Chinese privilege and Han Chinese knowledge production, erasing large parts of Asia where knowledge has been produced, but where also there have been strong concepts of democracy. The other idea that I want to just build on this with the notion of interrogation is the idea of decolonization as anti-emancipation, and where imperialism is equated to enlightenment, so that often in instances with decolonization logic, we turn to very dangerous places such as, we can't talk about human rights because that is Western. It is dangerous because once again it erases the struggles of people, but also it fundamentally turns its face away from the fact that there are many communities across Asia, across the global south, across decolonial spaces that are actually fighting for human rights using the language of human rights. So these simple narratives like, let's decolonize human rights and think of this as Western, actually work to support power and authoritarian control.
Yeah, so I mean, the point is to be careful, right? The point is to always be careful in our decolonial work. In what do we end up accidentally erasing or glossing over, or what do we end up accidentally perpetuating or buying into by using these sometimes quite problematic ways of talking about decolonization, which brings us to the last point, which is if we to decolonize anti-racism is almost like it's an exercise almost in what Octavia Butler talks about with science fiction, which is to produce a new world. It does not exist. You have to imagine it, and that's what decolonizing anti-racism has to do. It has to produce other imaginations, because the ones that we have right now are incomplete. They erase people, or they are just not working for many people all over the world, right? And but we want to look at what is existing, what is working. We want to incorporate already existing the wealth of knowledge and experience of activists and people in the global south into the kind of global discourse that we have at the moment. The more the merrier when it comes to these things, and the bigger we can make the space, the more likely it is that we will be able to produce these other imaginations, and hopefully one day we will be able to get to a kind of discourse that doesn't actually end up perpetuating or propagating these kinds of problems under the guise of decolonizing.
So I just want to wrap up, Sangeetha. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I want to wrap up by noting a couple of key points, I think. So one thing is that what we see decolonization as not. We do not see decolonization as using a culture brand to gloss over forms of capitalism, forms of capitalist extraction, and new forms of capitalist excellence.
Yeah.
Right? That is pretty much perpetuating the same kinds of capitalist logics that inherently erase. But we also think that to invite spaces for decolonization is to think beyond these kinds of simplistic logics, where culture is simply branded as another tool from new forms of capitalist extraction.
Yeah, something else to be commodified, to be added, right? Oh, we've got Malay, we've got Indian, we've got a black person. Let's just add this and that, and that. Okay, we're done. These kinds of the use of multiculturalism is actually really rooted in capitalism. And if we are going to produce other imaginations, as we would say, right, we need to really move towards anti-capitalist decolonization of anti-racism.
Right, and we see many examples of this, and that's the beauty. So we want to wrap up with hope.
Yeah.
Because there are many examples of this in truly living, breathing, subaltern communities across the global south, across the world. But that is not your Asian turn. That is not your Singapore model.
No.
Those are invitational spaces that one has to really listen to with humility, because those voices are so much at the margins.
At the margins, exactly. So, I mean, like Mohan was saying, definitely there's hope, because these other imaginations are already existing. It's just that the gaze is not on them, or we haven't looked at them. Then that's what I mean when I say we need to look at the wealth of knowledge and expertise and experience of these kinds of resistance of people in the margin and the global south, because that's where we're going to find the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it.
We're done.
Wrap up.
Professor, we have a Facebook question
Wow.
from Najla Amundsen.
Okay.
Yes. Hi, Najla.
Hi.
What do you think of China's investments in African countries? Is this a form of colonization?
That's a great question. Absolutely, yes. I mean, if you think about what characterizes colonization, it is a displacement of people, extraction of wealth, and occupation of cultures. So if you pay attention to what is going on in Africa, and I'm so glad you asked this question, you precisely see these things happening.
No, for sure. I mean, and that's the thing. China is selling itself as the antidote or the antithesis to American imperialism or to former Western colonialism, in much the same way. And the thing is, I think people think about this as something new. But the truth is, when Japan came to Asia during the occupation, during World War II, that's how it sold itself. Japan sold a greater co-Eastern prosperity sphere in which Japan was the head of, and part of Japan's selling point was, come join us, come join Japan, because we are anti-West, we are anti-colonial, we are anti-imperial. What turned out is that Japan colonized Southeast Asia and most of Asia for the better part of the 1940s. And so this has happened before in just the last century, and it's interesting to me that we are still actually wondering about this with China. It is colonialism. What is happening is colonialism, and how colonialism differs a little bit from racism is the extractive aspect of it, like Mohan was saying, and that's what's happening. China is in Africa extracting resources from Africa. How does that make China any different from the West? China sells itself as, oh no, we are here for exchange. While we extract your resources, we give you other things. Unlike the European colonies who only took from you and then walked away. But if you look at actual reports, right, these Chinese companies refuse to hire, train, educate actual African engineers, scientists, people on the ground. They bring their own people into the area, they extract, and then they leave. So it's really about looking at the details of these things, and definitely what China is doing in Africa is colonialism. But many people in Africa see this. A lot of African work around it. In fact, one of the earliest transcultural moments for me was when people in Ghana apparently read my work on Chinese privilege. And I was really like, what? What's happening in Ghana right now? Because I was like, what? Yeah, right? And they said it's because of the influx of Chinese people into their land and the kind of superiority they function with, the anti-black racism that they perpetuate on the people they are stealing from. You know, and
But that is colonialism.
and that is colonialism, yeah. And in this, right, I think it's really interesting that Western leftists and decolonial or post-colonial academics are actually unable to grapple with this because they see China as the anti-imperialist Asian turn. And if you see China as not an imperialist country in its own right, you will actually end up perpetuating and being complicit in this kind of exploitation of African people. Instead, there are African people who are readily fighting this, and what we need to be doing is listening to those voices and being a part of and supporting those movements.
Yeah, or for Western leftist ideas like China is a socialist country, or just like Singapore is a socialist country, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you laugh at that.
China is a
thought.
communist country. I mean, okay, right? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I hope that answered your question. It's all right if we have
I
none.
was thinking about when you had the list of those countries up before, and you know that.
All right.
I was thinking of how people who go to the States become the minority, and yet in their own country they're like the privileged class, and I was like, man, that would be awesome, because being here and not being, I guess, part of the majority, I don't have an experience of what that's like, and I was like, well, I could imagine myself in that situation, and being privileged and having all the power. And
Yeah.
Is it a bit like that, not to that degree, but in Australia, where you're not the Indigenous people there? Because a lot of Māori people move to Australia because they don't experience the same sort of racism, and they're kind of given a fresh start. Is it a bit like that?
I suppose you could say it's a bit like that, but a
No.
little
But
bit
it's
different.
still, but it's still, Maori people still are, I guess, but it's still quite racist in Australia towards Maori people.
But not as bad as the Aboriginals.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can't say. Racism towards Aboriginal people is truly horrendous in
Yeah.
Australia. So I don't know. Sometimes I think these conversations about this is not as bad as that really is. I mean, I understand the point of it, but it's also like it's all bad, right? So what is the point of us talking about? No, but you're right. Like so, sometimes it'll be great, right? And you can almost understand. And I think this happens a lot with Chinese Singaporeans. The only time Chinese Singaporeans talk about racism is when they've experienced racism in the West. So a lot of think pieces written by Chinese Singaporeans on racism is about, oh my God, Singapore is so awesome. I felt racism when I left Singapore. Everything outside is so terrible. That's why Singapore is so great. Or lately, they've gotten a little bit more woke. So now they write articles about how they realize they have Chinese privilege because they went to America and some white person treated them badly, called them a chink or something like that. And so that's right. So, and they rush back home. So many Chinese Singaporeans who go to study overseas, they go back to Singapore because that's where their privilege and power is. And it's seductive. It's like you said, right? Wouldn't it be nice? And yeah, it is nice for them, which is why, they go back home and do that. But that's the thing is that, of course, it's nice for us to think about a time in our lives or a place in the world where we are not oppressed, and it's nice to think about. But if our ability to not be oppressed is predicated on our ability to oppress other people, then what is the point of this privilege, or what is the point of being treated this way?